Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And today we're going to be continuing our discussion of the importance of change and the importance of impermanence and what we mean by that and why it's important. And I hope that you're having a lovely day. As you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments onto whatever platform you're watching on. They should appear here in my chat room and we can talk directly. Before we get into our subject, tonight at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern, I'll be doing my next magic and metaphysical auction through Gaia Thrift Central at whatnot.com. And hello to Nicholas in the chat room. It's good to see you, Nicholas. One of the things I will have in the auction is this artwork. This part down here is green. It's dropping out against my green screen, which is kind of interesting. But that is the artwork. It is an original artwork, and it will be part of the auction this evening. So if you're interested in that and other things I may have, join us. And we will have a lovely auction. Hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. And hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. I hope everyone is having a lovely day. And hello to Bimby in the chat room. As I was saying yesterday, change is an important part of the nature of life. Impermanence is part of the nature of life. And another word for this is growth. Without change, you do not grow. Without change, you are merely stagnant. And yes, when you've reached a certain plateau, it may seem nice to be stagnant for a while, at least. And life will sometimes let us do that for a while. But ultimately, we must continue to grow. And hello to Renee in the chat room. We must continue to grow. We must continue to change. And this is just part of the nature of physical life. I think it's part of the nature of all life. I think everything that exists is about growth and therefore change. And based on this, as I was saying yesterday, the idea of perfection as being a lack of change or a state of permanence, I find totally erroneous. I think that perfection is an ever-expanding cycle of growth. And I think that's what we see if we look at the world. And, we know today and have long theorized, because, the ancient Greeks were well aware of ideas like evolution and change in the world, even if they didn't think quite the same things we think about it. We've long known that the world was not always as it is now. It has been constantly changing. I was speaking on Friday of the discovery of dark oxygen at the bottom of the ocean, and how this changes our attitudes about the development of oxygen-breathing life. But even so, we know there was a time when oxygen-breathing life did not exist on this planet. And a long period of struggle between carbon-based and oxygen-based life forms that basically had to see which one would become dominant, and ultimately they both survived. And carbon is not the right word, but non-oxygen breathing life. And, if you look at this, we would not be better if during the period before oxygen breathing life arose, the Earth had simply stagnated in a constant plateau. So many things would never have been developed or happened. It's definitely good that we move forward. If we look at the development of humanity, we know that we were at an earlier point a much less developed sort of being. Perfect for our time and place, but very different from what we are now. I think we would have lost a great deal had we stagnated there and never changed. And Nicholas says some change is conscious and some is unconscious, and that's very true. Um, Although I think I would add to that when we have unconscious change, I think that there is also still a spiritual element of it that we certainly would not call conscious, but is coming from the higher levels of our being. And this is true, the importance of change when we look at our lives as well. You know, I was talking yesterday about how people often look back on their childhood as a kind of golden age, and they make the mistake of thinking that because they were in a good place without adult responsibilities, that the time period was a much better one than anything that came later. And hello to Arlene in the chat room. It's good to see you, Arlene. I've heard people say this about the 60s and the 70s, which is a clear way of saying you have no objective memory of that period. In the late 60s and early 70s, we had to be afraid of bombs in local shopping malls. We had to be afraid of the idea of terrorist attacks in this country, plane hijackings, etc. And the idea of an imminent revolution was very widespread. There were many good things happening, but there were lots of other things happening too that I wouldn't necessarily want to see again, though we seem to be flirting with that again. But as a child, many people didn't notice that. They don't remember that. But had we stagnated in that period and never changed, there'd be many things that we would not be better off for not having. Had we stagnated in our childhood and never grown up, I don't think that would be for the benefit of anyone. I think that as we grow up, we really learn how to understand and interact with life. And ideally, as we grow older, we continue to learn this, although some people insist on stagnating. I think that to become stagnant as you grow old is a terrible tragedy. And Mary Hawk says, breakfast with Captain Kangaroo was awesome. I remember Captain Kangaroo. He was awesome. And hello to Ed Carr in the chat room. It's good to see you, Ed. There were many wonderful things. There were also many things that weren't so wonderful. And, there were all kinds of riots and violence happening in that time. And maybe it didn't particularly touch a certain individual's childhood, and so they don't remember it, but it was there. The people who are children right now, when they have aged another 30 years, will remember this as a kind of golden age and forget all of the conflict that was happening. But it's very much here. People tend to adopt selective memory. And this is a defensive technique, I guess, to remember only the good. And there's a lot to be said for holding on to the good. But sometimes it creates false impressions. So I'm a great believer in noticing the good, appreciating the good, and holding on to the good. But I wouldn't say that you should ignore the bad. I can look back on the 1990s in some ways as a golden age for paganism in many areas. Our communities were thriving in Chicago. We had events that were drawing thousands of people. We had all sorts of open public groups, a very active community that did all sorts of activities. As the chief priest of Holy City Temple, I regularly went to as many as 5 other temples every Sabbat to maintain our connections with them, and they were there to be gone to. And other sorts of activities in the community, and pagan social night, and public rituals at the beach, pretty much all of which is gone now. But it was also the time of the identity wars. It was a time of immense emotional violence that eventually is what destroyed this. So remembering that good, I must also remember the things that were wrong in order to avoid them again. And above all, I must bear in mind the importance of the changes that came. We learn from change, we grow from change. I would not make the same mistakes again if I found myself in similar circumstances. I don't know that that's always true for everyone. It's not necessarily always true for me, but in this case, I'm fairly clear of where I perhaps should have been less naive in certain moments, or um, other things I might have done differently. When we look at our lives, they constantly change. And I think for us as people, it is our goal to make the most of those changes, to find the good in them, to carry forward the good from the past, but also to avoid the mistakes of the past. And it's our goal as leaders, either in our own lives or in organizations, to try to help our organizations to avoid the mistakes of the past while carrying forward the good and finding new good in new situations. And it is always important to remember that you never step in the same river twice. So if you are in a position of leadership or just in your everyday life, you find yourself dealing with a difficult situation, among the things you should do is look at whether you've ever faced a similar situation before and how you handled it. And did it work or did it not? Um, and also what has changed. And you'll often find that the technique that you used previously may not be suitable to the current situation. You must be flexible enough to always look for new ways of doing things. And hello to Steve Taylor in the chat room. It's good to see you, Steve. One of the ways in which, for me, this is most obvious is technology. We have always been on the cutting edge of technology, but we've also had people who were afraid of change and did not want to move to that next cutting edge of technology. It was the source of several major fights among our people, of which probably the most notable was the Yahoo groups fight. Many of our people did not want to move on from Yahoo groups. They did not want to hear that they had become passé and would eventually be eliminated. And they did not want to move on to the next platform. And this caused a lot of problems for the future because they dug in their heels and would not do it. We eventually did move on to not the next, but the next after platform. But we lost ground in doing that. And we're at a time now that in many ways we're looking at what is going to be the next platform. Things are changing again. The internet is changing again. We must be able to make that change. And this brings up the quote that I was using yesterday: to love your platform, or to love your message, do not love your platform. What I'm doing now, broadcasting through Restream, is a platform. What is the message? The message is what I'm saying. The message is arguably the fact of broadcasting what I'm saying. But the platform is Restream. Tomorrow, there may be a better platform, and I will need to adapt to that. Yesterday, the platform was YouTube. And you can still see this broadcast on YouTube, but you'll also be able to see it in many other places because I'm using Restream, which allows me to do that. And again, tomorrow, I may be using something else that allows an even greater push. And this is because I love my message, not my platform. And I will admit I'm not using the edge of the cutting edge graphics and so forth. I'm very old fashioned in how I present myself, but I do try to be up to the moment in the means through which I present myself. And I think this is a very important point to pay attention to. And this goes back to what I've been saying about people claiming they're not listened to. And the question of, well, how are you speaking? Are you using platforms that your desired audience is also using? Or are you trying to talk to a 21st century audience using 20th century techniques that they are not perhaps even aware of? This is one reason you might not be being listened to. Um, of course, the next question is, are you talking to them or talking at them? Um, but first and foremost, are you even a place where they could hear you? And if you want to be relevant, you must be where you can be heard. And speaking of being heard, we're going to take a moment to hear from our sponsor. And um, here we go. And thank you, sponsor. Thank you, Equinox Learning Hub. And that actually is relevant directly to our conversation. This is a service um, which is using the most up-to-date techniques to teach young people. And it's a good example of what I mean by embracing change, by the importance of change. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that how they were educated many years ago was somehow perfect, and that making innovations to education um, is screwing it up. And I think that while there are occasions this may be true, for the most part, it's ridiculous and comes from not really remembering your childhood experiences. One of the things I remember is that when I was a child in school, they were revising everything. And this was um, difficult in that a lot of us got caught between two different systems of teaching. And I think we would have done much better to have made a faster jump to the new systems rather than catching people in the middle. But of course, when you have change, you have change. But I would not want to go back to that system, particularly the system that was being replaced at that time, which was basically one of rote learning. And yes, it had some useful parts. But I think that as we have changed, we have in some ways greatly improved. Now, we've also in some ways not always made the right changes with our education. And sometimes that's been to serve certain agendas, um, particularly the agenda of Christian nationalism, which has part of its agenda um, to be the elimination of public education in favor of private religious education. But at the same time, I think that young people today are far more educated by and large than was the case in my day. Certainly in my childhood, they are not always equally educated in certain subjects. Um, you know, it's been pointed out in some of those memes I love to quote that if you go back to my mother's era, we were teaching Latin in high school, and today we're teaching remedial reading in college. However, there are that's a very misleading statement. For one thing, far fewer people were in high school in my mother's day, and far fewer of them graduated or felt it was important that they should. Um, I was talking to someone, it may have been on this program the other day, that my mother did not graduate high school. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school. I was not the first to get a college degree. My mother did get a college degree in later years, but she did not graduate high school because at that time, many women didn't expect to, didn't think they needed it. They very often married in the last year of high school, which is effectively what my mother did. Um, and that makes a big difference to um, to what you see in terms of contemporary education. In those days, a lot of people were not expected to go all the way through the educational system, and if they had various kinds of problems, they were removed. Today, they go all the way, but the problems are often not resolved. And so you do see those problems continuing to show up, whereas they don't appear to have shown up in the earlier system simply because they were excluded from the system. I saw another meme the other day, which speaks to this same thing, that it was to the effect that 90% of the foods that you buy in stores today did not exist 100 years ago, but also 90% of the diseases we see today did not exist 100 years ago. And this is absolutely false. A true statement would be 90% of the diagnoses that we see today did not exist 100 years ago. But with only a few exceptions, the diseases themselves did. They were described in other words. They were diagnosed in other ways. Cancer was very prominent 100 years ago, but commonly diagnosed as consumption. If you don't know that connection, you might be excused for thinking there was less cancer. There was not necessarily. If I look back on my own family, two of my grandfathers died from cancer, but one of them was diagnosed with consumption. My grandmother also had cancer. It was not absent at that time, but many of these things were diagnosed differently. If you look at things like the autistic spectrum, you could go back and say, well, in the 1940s, that didn't exist. And that's not true. It wasn't diagnosed because people weren't aware that it existed. But if you look at the people, you will see the signs that it was there. It was dealt with in different ways. And hello to Vivian in the chat room. It's good to see you. The expansion of our knowledge has allowed us to identify things we did not previously see. This is part of why change is important. And for you as a leader, whether you're leading your own life or leading an organization, this is part of why you must embrace change, because your knowledge will expand. You know, I've talked several times about the Witch War Defense Manual, of which Volume 2 is coming soon. And one of the things that Volume 1 did is it exposed a lot of people to the techniques that were widely used in the witch wars of the 90s and early 2000s. And this also, in a lot of ways, contributed to the demise of rampant witch war, even as these techniques continued to proliferate through the wider society. But once people understood what was happening, they could defend themselves against it. They could see that something was not a genuine reaction, but a strategy. One of the ones that I sometimes remark on, a common witch war strategy of previous years that people still try to use, is for a relatively unknown person to attempt to attack a well-known person, hoping that person will respond to them. If the well-known person responds to the unknown person, they effectively lift them up. They make it appear that they're on an equal basis. And this is a great benefit to that unknown person, who may have no reason on earth to actually be attacking the well-known person, except they know it will increase their visibility. That's a tactic. Once you know it, you can have your eyes open for it and realize that that unknown person being so negative may have an ulterior reason for being so negative. They're trying to increase their own visibility, trying to increase their own celebrity, for want of a better word for it. And you see this even now frequently. And it's not as common in the pagan community as it was. And I personally think, again, that the publication of the Witch Wars Defense Manual 20 years ago did help to short circuit some of these techniques, but you do still see it. But you see it very widely in our wider community. In wider society, you see people use this all the time. And nobody in most of that society stops to think, why are they launching this attack? Is there something other than what they're saying? And there almost always is. One of the things that Lady Bitterwind used to love to say, and for her, it came primarily from a song that she loved, whose name I don't remember. But the line was, ask yourself, who does this serve? And when you see, if the answer is not you, pay attention. But with any conflict that you see, asking yourself who is actually being served here is always a good idea. Why is someone being combative? Why does this fight exist? And does it exist for actual reasons, or does it exist to improve someone's visibility? Is it a political tactic? Very often you'll find it is. If you're going to be in a position of leadership, you cannot simply view things passively. You have to ask yourself why they're happening, why people will take certain points of view, certain actions, because very often there is a strategic answer hiding behind the facade of what they're saying. And, is this a terrible thing? Well, no, we all have our moments of strategy. But it is wise to keep this in mind. And the more extreme the attack, the more likely it is, in my opinion, to be a political motivation, something that's intended to increase the position of the person making the attack. And if you see them getting more and more extreme, I think, to me, that is the exclamation point behind the realization. And if you look around you, you see this all the time. Because when someone has an actual point to make, it will not be a personal attack. They'll make the point. And they won't constantly keep expanding it. They'll make the point in the first place. And it's not going to be, oh, this person is terrible. It's going to be, I do not feel this particular situation is appropriate. It's a very different kind of thing. But when you see an ad hominem attack, an attack on the person, always, always take it with a grain of salt. And always ask yourself what's going on. Because usually it's not going to be a good answer. And with that, I see that we've come to the end of our half hour. I will be back tomorrow with Chris Copeland, my usual Wednesday guest. On Thursday and Friday, I will be in transit to Buffalo, New York for the regional illustration. So I will have best of middays on those 2 days, but they'll still be interesting. So I hope you'll tune in anyway. And I will see if I can't find some of our more interesting past episodes to put up on those 2 days. And with that, let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks for all that you do for us in our lives. We rejoice in this walk we walk together. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to always keep our minds open, but also keep our minds open to ulterior motives that people may have in their actions, so that we are not caught by surprise. And help us always to embrace change and the increasing perfection of life as we know it, which can only be accomplished through change. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love, and knowing you are all with us, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. I thank you for your presence.